Well, good morning to everybody. Back in 2010, I visited Burundi, a war-torn country in East Africa. And at that point, the rebels had just signed a peace agreement with the government. And I was there to talk to these young people, some of them, believe it or not, as young as 16. And they were the foot soldiers. They were the rebels. They were the combatants in the civil war that went on for many, many years. After the agreement was signed, they agreed to lay down their arms, and here I am talking to them, trying to convince them to join the program that the United Nations and the government had run to try to reintegrate them back into society, right? Because obviously, you cannot have a situation with young men walking around with guns, AK-47s, some of them, and expect the peace to be sustainable, obviously. So in fact, this picture may sound strange, but this is a very common picture in my work. The first thing we do when we come to a country that has come out of civil war is to do this program that we call DDR, meaning that we demobilize, disarm, and try to reintegrate these combatants, right? Very important, because if you don't achieve that, you'll never have sustainable peace, because it will just relapse back into war, as you can imagine, right? That the poor countries, no jobs, no future. So this is a very common sight. So you may actually ask me, what is this? How is this relevant to you? Here we are sitting in comfortable, peaceful Penang. How is this relevant to you? So I hope by the end of my talk, I will be able to convince you that this phenomenon of failed states concerns us all, including you. So what are these failed states? Failed states, just think Somalia, Syria, Yemen, right? Those are fast becoming failed states, the last two. These are countries where the government has lost control, very limited role over vast amounts of the country, where security cannot be guaranteed for anyone, right? There's no security. The economy is in shambles. So we're talking about broken countries. These are broken countries, not functioning. But I like to make a distinction between what in my field we call failed states versus fragile states. Okay, fragile states are the ones that are some 30 or 40 around the world, who are in and out of war for decades, but they're trying to recover. But they're still fragile, and that's why they're called fragile states, because any little thing can push them over the abyss again. And these are called fragile states, but not as bad as the failed states that I had described earlier. But the main point here is that these states provide perfect havens for terrorists and drug lords, right? If you were a terrorist, the perfect environment for you to function in is a failed state. There's no government, no security. You can do as you wish, right? And that's why this is so important today for all of us to try to understand this phenomenon of failed state and what the consequences are. Globalization, we all know about globalization in trade, in goods, and money. Unfortunately today, globalization affects terrorism as well. Terrorists are globalizing, and so are drug lords. So, I'd like to talk to you about the characteristics of a failed state. Very briefly, obviously it's a long, complicated issue. But number one, all these countries, without exception, are poor countries. They are the bottom of the list, no matter what rankings you're looking at. And usually what happens is there's an internal or an external shock that pushes them into civil war, right? So internal shock can be, for instance, the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring brought about what none of us expected, chaos and war in so many of these places. As well as external shocks, commodity prices of their main products plummeting, suddenly there's no more economy, and before you know it, civil war strikes. And I'm not saying civil war is there, but for instance, one country to look out for is Venezuela today, which is really suffering as a result of an external shock. And then you have, you also have poor governance. Unfortunately, all these countries not only poor, but they are unfortunate enough to have governments that do not govern, that do not understand what governing is about. So as you can imagine, government neglects its citizens, doesn't bring about development, doesn't bring basic services like education and health, and certainly doesn't provide security. The police are corrupt, ineffective in these countries usually. And so is justice. There's no justice to talk of. Justice is for the elites, not for the masses of people. So this is one of the characteristics. I think you can see this picture. I don't know if you know this lady. She is the first African woman president. Her name is President Ellen Sirleaf Johnson of Liberia in West Africa. She inherited a country, unfortunately, so typical of many of these countries, where everything happens only in the capital city. Once you leave the capital city, there's nothing to think of. There's no police, hardly any police, no development. Schools are sort of left to their own. And in fact, people outside these capital cities where the elites live, they're very resentful of government. So in fact, when government shows up, people get very angry, and usually conflicts may break out. So she inherited this kind of a country, and here we were talking about what the United Nations could do to help her in her efforts to decentralize, and in this particular case, decentralize justice, rule of law, how we can start bringing about courts, functioning courts in this area to try so many cases that have been sort of sitting. This is a totally different country altogether. This is Guatemala, a country in Latin America and Central America. This is a country, if I can describe it very briefly, with a very small European elite, and a massive majority of very poor indigenous people, mainly indigenous people. There are rebel groups as a result, mini revolutions here and there. There's organized crime here and there. There's impunity, so people get away with murder, literally. So you can imagine all these are ingredients for a civil war to rage on and on and on for decades. That's what makes these civil wars go on for so long. And here I was discussing with the president and the cabinet what we can do to strengthen rule of law and to bring about, at least a semblance of justice. Now, obviously, we don't just talk to the highest levels of government. We also talk to various levels of government. In this picture, I'm sitting here with community leaders in the rural area of Afghanistan to talk about the plight of the internally displaced people, of which there are many in Afghanistan, as you can imagine. This is to make the point that we must have discussions. We must consult all kinds of stakeholders, not just the highest levels of government, civil society, local leaders, local community leaders. This is what constitutes what we call stakeholders. Unfortunately, a lot of international community and international aid, they think dealing with the government is sufficient, but they do that to their peril, because any development program, and certainly any program to bring about peace that doesn't involve a local population, the civil society, and local leaders is going to fail. That I can tell you with my experience, it's going to fail. So very important to touch base with them. So I've told you about poverty, I've told you about the poor governance, and a very important third element, third characteristic of these countries is a large population of idle, poorly educated youth. Unfortunately, in these conflict-prone countries, the young population makes up a majority. 70% in most cases are people under 25. But unfortunately, there's little education. So they're poorly educated, or in the case of Liberia, because of the years of civil war, no education at all, none, missed out for decades. So no education, despair, no hope for the future, sitting around idle. What do you expect? What do you expect? With poor governance. They see it happening, all that corruption, all those elites driving around in big cars. What do you expect? then obviously they become easy recruits. Anyone wanting to start an insurgency, whether it's a revolution against some group, whether it's against an ethnic group, whether it's just to steal from the gold mines or the diamond mines, it's actually very easy to recruit your foot soldiers, your militias in these kinds of settings. So that's what happens, and you saw that in the first picture. All these young boys were actually recruited. Number two, in this day and age, I'm afraid to say, when you have this kind of situation, it's ripe for radicalization. We have seen it time and again in so many countries, not just the Middle East, elsewhere as well. Radicalization, and today this is more important and more dangerous than ever to have this kind of situation. And then we have a third consequence of idle young people: brain drain, right? And how can the country ever develop when your young people, especially the ones with some education, run away? How can you possibly have development? And that's what we see. That's what you see in evening news every day. People in desperation leaving in these rubber dinghies across the Mediterranean at the risk to their lives. By the way, for your information, do you know how much a ticket, to get a seat on this rubber boat across the Mediterranean is? $2,000 US. $2,000 US. So we're not talking about the poorest of the poor. We're talking about people with some means, usually with some education, and in fact, a lot of them, are business people. Some are even professionals fleeing the country. How can a country ever develop when you have that situation? Okay, this picture should show you it need not always end in despair. It need not. This is another country in West Africa, Guinea. Guinea is potentially a very rich country, but yet it's been wrecked by civil war, by conflicts for many, many years. But here, the United Nations started a program for the youth with UNICEF. I'm sure you know about UNICEF. And this is, these young people you see smiling, some of them were actually involved in some kind of insurgency movement. Not all, but some of them were. And this program was to train them in acrobatics, in entertainment, so that they can eke out some living for themselves. Some of them work in the tourism industry or move to neighboring countries where tourism is more robust, and they're able to find jobs. But they have a sense in life, and that's why they're smiling. When they're not smiling for the camera. They have a sense in life. They feel that they're appreciated, and that's what peace building is all about. So lastly, another characteristic of these conflict-prone countries, these failed states, are ethnic problems, ethnic divides. That's why I was so happy to hear early on this issue is being tackled. We have grievances, suspicion, lack of trust between one ethnic group and another, between one religious group and another. Even in geographical regions, they distrust each other. You cannot build a nation that way. There's no national identity, which is so important if you want to stop conflicts. National identity is very important. So unfortunately, in these conflict-prone states, most of them suffer from this situation of grievances against each other, a sense of exclusion, and thus despair. This is a picture of me with the leader of Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi. Those of you who have been to that beautiful country, you've been to Rangoon, you'll see what's the problem. Rangoon is a normal capital city. Well, once you leave Yangon and you go to the outer provinces, especially to the provinces on the east, Shan province, Kachin province, I don't know if you know this, but civil war has been waging there for decades in these provinces. And these are different ethnic groups. These are the tribal groups that the central government doesn't even know about, doesn't care about, neglects them completely. And in fact, when they show up in these regions, it's only to harass them or to steal their minerals. So people see government officials, military people arriving with great suspicion, and that usually sparks a conflict. So in fact, the conflict is between the tribal groups and the military in these regions. And here we were discussing how we can bring about some development to this region, some infrastructure development, so that these people understand that peacetime can bring some good things. Peace accords had been signed with many of these groups at that time. So what saves countries? Is it always hopeless? Is it always descending to hell situation? No, not necessarily. If you're serious about one thing especially, there are many other factors, but one especially, institution building. If you work with a good international partner, if the UN is able to play its role well, and we can build institutions, right? We start the building blocks for a nation. Start building institutions, whatever the institutions may be. But a lot of times, we start with security. Security and rule of law, the most important. If your police are not effective, if they're corrupt, if they cannot control situations of conflict, then it's going to escalate, and before you know it, it's a civil war. So building the security institutions, the rules, the courts of law, the justice, the rule of law is very important. And we find a lot of times that once we get that right, then, of course, then you continue with education, with agriculture, et cetera. There's so many other institutions that you have to build. But that's the key, though, is to be able to stop the conflict before it escalates. Because believe you me, the problem with these countries is they sign peace accords, and within the year, before the year is out, it's back to war. It's back to conflict. So these characteristics I've described, that they're not so surprising, right? And they're pretty common sense. What do you expect? If you're going to have idle young men around with no education with guns, you're going to have war. You're going to have war. And what kills me is that when I go to these countries, I just can't understand how the leaders of these countries don't see that. They only see padding their own pockets. They don't see that they have to invest in this youth for the future. So I think it's not so mysterious what goes on in these countries. But the fact of the matter, and that's the point I want to make to you today, it's that the world is a more dangerous place today, surely you must admit, than a decade or so ago. It's a more dangerous place today for reasons that you know. And when you have these failed states, they provide breeding ground. They provide havens for terrorism. They provide havens for terrorism and for drug lords. So we must be extra, we cannot be complacent or dismissive. We cannot say this doesn't affect us because we're in tranquil little Penang. No. With globalization of everything, including terrorism, it's going to affect us all, one way or another, one day. So it's really incumbent upon all of you, you bright, young, educated people, to heed this and to pay attention, to have some interest. And maybe some of you may actually enter careers that might actually help in this area, help mitigate these problems. So with that, thank you so much for listening. I hope I've convinced you. Thank you very much.